I just walked out of my 6th grade class, walked across, and I walked into this old auditorium, and it was very dark. And I walked right back by John Cage and David Tudor, and they were still just getting ready. And Merce Cunningham came out of the shadows, and they rehearsed a piece. And I just remember thinking, oh, there's something out there. But there was something about the way he moved, his relationship to his body, that was transformative. And I always hold that as the moment when I kind of woke up to something that I didn't know about, that truly affected me and touched me.
Welcome to Ambient Discourses, conversations with musicians and composers who create musical experiences and sonic landscapes. My guest on the program is the esteemed American composer, Tina Davidson, and she has had an absolutely prolific career, having collaborated with the likes of the National Symphony Orchestra, the Philadelphia Orchestra, American Composers Orchestra, VocalEssence, Kronos Quartet, and many more. She's just an absolutely sweet person with an openness to the universe, an openness to spirituality, and wherever the world takes her. And it shows in her genuineness in her compositions. And I think that you're going to really love this conversation. Without further ado, let's just get right to it. I present my conversation with composer Tina Davidson. Hi, Tina. Welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here on Ambient Discourses, and I'm really excited to have this conversation because for the first time now, well, maybe technically not the first time, but there is a huge local connection for me between you and me, and his name is Philip Brunell with VocalEssence. And while I've not had the privilege of performing and singing under his tutelage and under his conductor's baton, I've been to a number of VocalEssence shows, have listened to all the things. So it's when I saw the press release come by for the suite that you composed for VocalEssence, I was like, I need to have this conversation. So it's wonderful to have you here, and I'm delighted to get to know you, get to know your music, and of course we'll talk about the brand new album that you worked on in tandem with VocalEssence, plus your new memoir. You have a new memoir out.
Yes. So first of all, thank you so much. I'm just delighted to be here. And my new album is called Hymn of the Universe. And so VocalEssence does almost everything on the album. It has 2 extra pieces and then Hymn of the Universe, which is about 30 minutes long. So they do Antiphon for a Virgin and Hymn of the Universe. And you're right, in March I released a memoir called Let Your Heart Be Broken, and Life and Music of a Classical Composer. And I've been composing for almost 50 years now, and the book is not only about my childhood and my musical upbringing, but also how I write music and my relationship to writing music over the years. So I'm delighted to be here and to talk to you about.
Yeah, let's just dive right into that, because I'm really fascinated with each individual's unique ways and approach to ushering music into the universe, and everyone has their own unique spin.
Yes.
Things that they do. Let's walk the audience into what it's like for you in the creative process.
Well, in Let Your Heart Be Broken, what I do, which is kind of interesting, is that every other chapter is a short story about my life. And then the alternate chapter is actually a year of journals. So I am an avid journalist. So part of my composing process is to read I wouldn't call myself a voracious reader now, but I used to be voracious, and I just read anything. But I was always looking for information to feed my composing mind. It was kind of like, it was like having breakfast. Every morning I had breakfast of reading. And then journaling became a very important part of my life, not so much to document what I was doing, but what I was thinking, what I was feeling, and how I was composing. And actually, I kept a composing journal, a personal journal, and then actually a spiritual journal. So I had, every other chapter is a year of these journals. And my publisher asked me, she said, well, how much of your journal do you, because they'd be 15, 20 pages, and then it would be another short story and another year. So I do 10 years of journals. And I said, well, probably I took maybe 10% of the journal, because, journals are a lot of blah, 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 blah. And, and a lot of times they're the way you process life around you, which is not very interesting. Much. Like, I hate her. How could they do? That's sort of like, I always call it garbage in and garbage out. But I was writing also a lot about what I was reading and a lot about my composing process. So I think the book really gives you sort of a hands-on, this was what was going through my mind while I was creating music. And also while I was living my life. This is the relationship I was having with my music to my life, and from my music back to my life. And I've always been a composer that really uses my own self as a template. So I think that other composers just don't do that. But I always feel that what I'm going through right now is grist for the mill in my music. So in my 30s, I was going through a lot of personal reevaluation of my childhood. So I was writing things about my childhood. There's a set of pieces called Descending Figure with Lullaby, and it was poems about the death of a child. There's another one called The Our Child Sings, which was allowing that sort of dark part of myself to have voice. And then I slowly started to move into things that were more spiritually oriented after about 20 years, sort of in the third decade of my composing. I was really starting to be interested in what is my relationship to things that are beyond my imagination or the earth, or and certainly the pieces on the recording, which now we're going to go back to the recording Hymn of the Universe, was a big part of that. For instance, I'll give you an example. I wrote a string quartet, and it's called The Delight of Angels. And I read that angels, according to Christian and Jewish tradition, they dance without stopping in their joy of being connected to God. And I just thought, what would that be like to be that joyous that all you could do was express it in this sort of dance, in movement. And I would say that a lot of my music has a lot to do with energy and movement and how I move through things. So this was kind of perfect, The Delight of Angels. So that's really what my memoir is about. It's that relationship between my life and my music in a sort of discrete period of time, sort of the second and third decade of composing.
Wow, it's fascinating how much of our personal life bleeds into what we try and segregate as our creative space, or even our spiritual space. We kind of compartmentalize these things as humans, but they're really kind of part and parcel for or there's an interweaving relationship between that. And how did you see that in with your journals? Because you had your 3 separate journals of, spiritual, your composing journal and your life journal. Did you see a lot of bleed through in each of those 3 different areas as you're writing and reflecting?
For me, it's all one sort of mashed potatoes. I think I grew up as a classical pianist, and although my teachers gave me a lot of contemporary music, I just didn't know it was contemporary music. And I was quite a good pianist by the time I got to college. But what I really resonated with is a composer's authentic voice. I felt that when they were truly authentic to themselves and their time and place, wherever they were in their lives, to me, that's what I imagined connected the most to me. And so then there was no distinction between my personal life and my creative life. And in a funny way, I don't know if you have this experience, but I was extremely focused, and, I was a single parent, and it wasn't like I was just in my garret all alone, but I was extremely focused. And in a funny way, music became like a second life for me. It was, it was like, when can I get back to this other life that I need to be in? And, right. So that was really, so I never made any distinctions between composing and my personal life. It all felt like the same thing. And that just is my take. I know a lot of composers just don't do that. They don't, although how could you not be in that place? I think it depends upon whether you're doing it intentionally or unintentionally, but it's still there.
Yeah, there's the what is your intention as you are approaching to writing music? Are you purely writing it for your own self, your own ego, or doing some of the things that people expect of us, kind of falling into routine, or is it really stopping to just to be observant and to listen and to be sensitive and let those things kind of surface?
And the truth is that it depends upon what you're writing. Certainly when I was writing Hymn of the Universe, they had already performed Antiphon for a Virgin. In fact, VocalEssence loved it so much they had actually memorized it. And I had never had like a big group memorize a piece of music. I was really just gobsmacked by that. And when I was writing it for them, when I write for someone like Hilary Hahn or the Kronos Quartet, I think about them. How do they play their instruments? Like Kronos Quartet, the first violinist, he's thin and kind of wiry, and I don't think he sleeps much. How does that impact his playing? So it's both. It's all those things. Who's listening? What do I want to say? That can get kind of complicated sometimes. And certainly when I'm just writing a piece for myself, it's different. The audience is different. What do I want to hear?
Right.
And I don't think any of those perspectives are wrong. They are just, it depends upon what's going on in your life.
Right.
And I think when I have a commission, it is a lot more pressure. It is more pressure.
You have to deliver.
I mean, you just can't get away from that. I can't get away from that.
Yeah.
When it's personal, I think the pieces, I don't want to say they're smaller, but it's just different. I'm writing a piece right now, and I'm doing a lot of experimenting with chords. It's for piano, and I want to get a kind of a string sound where you're kind of glissing down, but you can't do that on the piano.
Right. It's very challenging. Yeah.
I'm really interested when you beat a chord, like if you're playing it multiple times, or you're oscillating it like this, and the sound when you're playing it may be different the closer you get to the music, to the instrument than far away. But I love that kind of sort of trying to create a more of a shimmering effect. And of course, if you're a good pianist, maybe you'll, if someone was playing it, sometimes I have to say, oh, slow that down. That's faster than I wanted it. You're too good. But certainly writing Hymn of the Universe, considering Philip, considering the ensemble, it's like creating this almost beautiful suit of clothing. You're the designer. You get to create whatever you want, but it has to fit them.
That's so beautiful. That takes me right back to collegiate choir when we were under Weston Noble at Luther College, and you become very intimately acquainted with these pieces, particularly when you memorize them. It gets you remove the distraction of black and white on paper, and cognitively making sure that you're in the right place, and there's just too many distractions. But when you have the piece in you, then I feel, can have it's almost like a dialogue with the composer. You're working together to create this or recreate something. No, you not even recreate. You're creating a brand new representation of that piece. It's a whole new experience. You're creating a brand new universe, and it's to me, it's such a special relationship between the composer and the performer. I'm really curious about your perspective. So when you're thinking about Philip or other composers as you're writing for them, take me into a little bit of the relational dynamic that's in your mind as you're contemplating how to write for a composer, and maybe even the process of letting go and allowing the composer allowing the conductor the freedom to interpret and take it someplace.
And I have a pretty flexible relationship to my music, which really works to my benefit. I always feel like I'm in a place of collaboration. So first of all, I'm not only collaborating with the music, but when I'm setting texts, I'm really collaborating. My job setting text is to get to the heart of what the text is trying to say, both musically and also in terms of the articulation of the words. So I feel like my job is to hold up the words, not to sort of co-opt them. It is this, and these texts came from. Let me just go back, and I will answer this in a long way, but let me give you this story of Hymn of the Universe. So I was in Kansas City. I think I was with the Kansas City Orchestra. I don't know why I was there, but I was being housed by a board member of the symphony, and she was someone who worked for HR in a really. I don't even know what company, but it was a big company. She was this lovely woman, and we spent a lot of time together, and she finally told me that she was a former nun, and she had given up the order and had gone in. And she said, after I've been talking to you, I think you should read the books of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was he was an amazing Catholic priest. I think he was a Jesuit, and I think he was a Jesuit. And they kind of are a little bit out there, on the edge.
Yeah.
And he had written all these books. He had been born in the 50s. And yeah, he was renowned for his pioneering fieldwork in paleontology. But he also believed in evolution. So he wrote these books about how we are evolving towards Christ. We are on this. And of course, the Vatican really didn't like that word, evolution. So they would send him off to Tibet, go back to your bones, go away, go teach. So he wrote these books that are quite pithy, but they were really about our relationship to the earth and our love of the earth, and that we and the earth are in a state of evolution. So getting back to collaboration, I read a lot of his books, and then I created 3 big movements that were based on his books. And the first one, he's in Tibet, and he's climbing up a mountain, and he gets to the top of this mountain, and there's this sunrise, and he is just so awestruck. And he says, here I am. I've come all this way to meet you, God. And I have nothing. I didn't bring anything to make a Eucharist. I didn't bring any wine. I didn't bring any bread. So I will offer up myself. And that at the end of that movement, he says, this bread, our toil is of itself. Our wine is the pain. But what we really want to do is that you've implanted this desire irresistible, which makes us cry out, Lord, make us one. I'm not a Christian, I'm not a Catholic, but boy, that really spoke to me. So how do I collaborate with that text to illuminate it and to be true to this? And so there's this, particularly when I'm writing with text, there's this twofold collaboration that I have, not only with the music, but with the text. The music is like, how do I bring myself to this? And then I always feel that the collaboration, once the piece is done, and we can talk about the other movements another time, but once the piece is done, then I start to collaborate with the performers. They have to take on the piece. They have to manifest it in some way. And I have to allow them enough flexibility. Maybe they'll make some suggestions, or even the way maybe I didn't really quite consider all the breathing that they have to do. We have to add some breathing, right. And some of the dynamics. A lot of times we have to shift that. But I always come to it as I am collaborating with the ensemble, with the conductor. And then I always feel that then the ensemble goes and collaborates with the audience. And to me, that whole process is a kind of collaboration. I have to remain true to my ideas. Sometimes I'll say, oh, that's probably not going to work for me. Sometimes I just have to let them, let's try it out. What you got? What do you got? Show me.
Yeah, right.
And then sometimes I say, how about this? Let's do the first performance and see how the way I wanted it, and see how it shakes out. Because that first performance is so important in the shaping of a piece. So I love that idea of collaboration. And usually I said this lately to an ensemble. I said, okay, you're going to go out there, forget the music, forget the notes. They're really not that important. So you make a mistake, who cares?
Right.
Just it doesn't really matter. What matters is that you're communicating with the audience. So you have my permission to.
That is just such a beautiful reflection of the continuum that is in collaboration from the source all the way to the listener. I appreciate too the sensitivity and the humility to work with text that speaks with you, but isn't really necessarily a total reflection of even where you stand as a human being. And that, I think that takes a lot of humility and self-confidence confident about who you are and what you think and you believe, and yet being able to enter into the space of a text that has its own meanings, but yet has some universal resonance to it. Things that we can all go, oh yeah, I connect with that.
Yes.
I mean, similar for myself, I came out of evangelical Christianity. I grew up Lutheran, went evangelical for a way, and then I had my own downfalls, but eventually settled into this place of finding the spiritual in the ordinary, finding the spiritual in ways that are more broadly universal, that we probably we miss out on because we're so busy, we're so tapped out. We have constantly on the phone scrolling and all of the things. But in that quiet space of reflection, and you're doing that in journaling. A lot of people do that in meditation, or some people do that in quiet listening or reading, or going for nature walks, and there's this beautiful stillness in the universe of just presence, and to be able to sit comfortably in that space, regardless of whatever the text is, and to tease that out, tease out the feeling of equanimity and just radiant beauty in the midst of ordinary humanity.
Well, and that you don't have to be preaching a way of life to share the innate universality of what is being said. You don't have to be a Catholic to read these texts and go, oh yeah, oh yeah. It's not even a word. It's, oh yeah. And I'm always looking for that experience. I have a piece for strings and piano. Actually, it was a string orchestra piece called Barefoot. And it was in the winter, and I just wanted to take off my shoes and touch the earth. That idea of just being in the earth, and that special connection to the earth that you have with your feet. And then I was thinking about Moses and the burning bush, and how, as he approaches God says to him, if you're going to get any closer, you need to take off your shoes. And I just love that idea of bearing your SOLE, your soul, to the earth and to God to receive what is there. And so this piece is called Barefoot. And my music I wouldn't say that it's a picture of being barefoot. It's just, I hold that idea in my head, and then I just sort of let the music sort of tell me where it's going. I have some sort of scientific or logical or experimental or some external ideas that I'm interested in, like,
sure,
how can I take this melodic section and just make it not a minute, but 4 minutes? Is that possible to extend it so that you don't, and not repeat the melody, but you feel like you're in that? And even with Hymn of the Universe, I felt that the text was so gripping and so evocative that it took time to experience it. You couldn't just go through it in 5 minutes, or, you had to almost be in that flow for a long period to absorb it. I tend to repeat a lot of the words that I love. So if there's a phrase that I think, I always feel like that words are like beautiful stones in my mouth, and oh, this just tastes so good, or I just love, the smoothness of it. So
Yeah.
I do tend to repeat. I very rarely go through a text just from top to bottom, because my mind works. As I'm reading, I'm also connecting forward and backwards and to the side. So I think that's the way I like to compose it.
That's just really wonderful. Tell me about some of the people that have influenced you, whether growing up or through maybe even your recent years. Who are some of the people that have been who have had a profound effect on you as a human, as a composer, musician?
I went to Bennington College, and their relationship to contemporary music history, was very much of an American history. If you go to like the University of Pennsylvania or, any of the higher PhD programs, they certainly, when I was younger, they tended to be very Western music oriented. But Bennington was always about, let me see if I can think of some of them. Carl Ruggles, Henry Cowell. They were just kind of East Coast, Charles Ives. They didn't really play to any of those Western music idealization. They loved it, but they didn't idealize it. I don't think that they felt that their voice was coming out of a European tradition. Colin Noncaro. So then I really started to feel that my people were experimental composers, although my music is not experimental by any stretch of the imagination, but they embodied for me much more of that kind of interested in, I want to say, a living relationship to what you're not connected to the past. How am I going to be a Beethoven now? But a more of an experimental living relationship with composing. I have to say that when I was 12, Merce Cunningham and John Cage came to my mother's college. She was a professor in upstate New York. And my mother called up the office and said, I'm giving my daughter permission to walk out in the middle of the day of the school and walk across to the college and go to some of the dress rehearsals. Of course, we would never imagine doing this now. The child needs to be chaperoned. It's got to be a blood relative,
You have to have passed your FBI background check.
All of the things. I walked out of my 6th grade class, walked across, and I walked into this old auditorium, and it was very dark. And I walked right back by John Cage and David Tudor, and they were still just getting ready. And Merce Cunningham came out of the shadows, and they rehearsed a piece, and I just remember thinking, oh, there's something out there. I mean, I was a total ballerina nut, but there was something about the way he moved, his relationship to his body, that was transformative. And I always hold that as the moment when I kind of woke up to something that I didn't know about, that truly affected me and touched me. And so I did a lot of work with Pauline Oliveras. I became the president of New Music America, which was an organization that had been developed, I think, in '75, because nobody was performing music of composers who were outside of the university. So they decided to have a festival, like Steve Reich and Philip Glass. And so I later became by mistake became the president of the board. And the last big festival was up in Montreal. It was always about 10-day festival usually. And what these composers did is they got together, they created this festival, and then the next year they'd chop it to another city. And they'd say to a presenter, why don't you do this? We'll help you fundraise or something. And they created this organization that had no overhead at all. It had no overhead because the ensemble or whoever was the presenter took the overhead. So it was in Miami, it was in Washington, it was in San Francisco, it was at Brooklyn Academy of Music. There was a big one there. And that's sort of when I became president. And the rules were really pretty simple. It's contemporary music. You have to present women. You have to present crossover jazz. And we would really support you supporting crossover rock and roll. But it was experimental composers mostly. And in Miami, it was in Miami, but in Montreal, at that moment, the funding in the United States kind of fell apart. That was when the National Endowment stopped giving money to artists directly. That was the Mapplethorpe, Serrano, Karen Finley, where they felt that they were using sexual terms in music and that the government shouldn't support it. So that all that funding stopped. So I did one more festival, which was New Music Across America. I had 14 different cities, plus 2 in Canada and 2 in Europe. And then I fundraised money to go back to these ensembles. And it was a 4-day festival, but it was happening all at the same time, which was super cool to think that, there were so many of these festivals going on at the same time. So that's just to say, my music doesn't sound experimental, but I feel that my roots are in experimental music. And certainly Pauline Oliveros was, a giant in that respect, and in community building and rethinking how one creates music. That's kind of a long answer.
No, that's just wonderful. I really enjoy just hearing all the unique stories, and I identify too with that, the connecting with experimental music, because there's something liberating about hearing things done differently, hearing different techniques, hearing things that are unorthodox. Why would you do that to a violin?
Right.
Or challenging our sensibilities and
the way that we as composers and performers interact. Pauline took a real step further in that a lot of her musics were word driven. And so she would ask the performers to play a piece which was improvised, but it was based on words like soaring, connecting, supporting. So sometimes you were soaring in your improvisation, sometimes you were connecting with you would hear something and then connect with them. And sometimes you would hear another performer and you would do something that was supportive of what they were doing. And, she really was thinking about a larger kind of relationship that you can have with music and creating music, which I really appreciated.
That's something that doesn't get talked about enough, I think, is our relationship with music and the ways that we can interact with it beyond the traditional, here's my sheet music, here's my piano, and I'm going to play what's on the sheet music. Or I'm listening to whatever's on Spotify. What you're talking about is a much deeper living entity, like it's to, how would I say this? I'm trying to illustrate this with a metaphor, but it's like, if I could borrow from the mycology world of mushrooms and mycelium, it's the compositions themselves, they spring up to me kind of like mushrooms, but there's something underneath the surface of it all. What I liken to think of as the electrical current, or the musical frequency of humanity and creation and all things living that we share this existence with, and that underneath it all is this song of creation that and it doesn't have words, it's just this feeling, and it's for me, it feels like this multifaceted, ever-evolving progression of harmony and dissonance and movement and change, and that to me, that when you start to have that kind of observational relationship with music, and you're starting to listen not for what the individual instruments are doing, but listening to the combined relationship, the harmony of all these things, and how the dissonance adds an element of tension, and then resolving to some sort of release. And I really appreciate you bringing up the relationship to music, because it's something I don't think we talk about enough in our music education classes, growing up through our formative years, or even in college. In fact, I remember going through a music listening class at Luther, and we listened to the music, but there wasn't enough of the deep inquisition of, all right, what do these two parts, how does this make you feel inside when you hear the juxtaposition of these two phrasings? You've got something that's more confident and something that's more, whatever it may be, some sort of contrast. And I think we would do.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
One of the things that I have really worked hard at in the last 20, 25 years is creating programs for anybody to compose music. So I think that is part of the conversation, is that in our sort of classical music world, we relegate the creation of it to geniuses, to the Mozarts, to the, we don't bring it down to sort of the vernacular, where when I was a kid, I went to my kindergarten class, and there was an easel over in the corner of the room with the paints all laid out. And the teacher I write about this in my book, the teacher helped me get on a smock. And then she gives me the best art lesson in the world. And it's, try not to get the paints on the floor.
Yeah.
And then it's not that I became a great artist, but I was given permission to do what I needed to do.
Yes. Yeah.
I wasn't told what paintbrush to use, what color to use, blah, 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 blah. So I created a program for inner city school kids when I was living in Philadelphia, called Young Composers. And we always started with building an instrument. And I taught in schools that were really pretty poor, so they didn't have instruments in their school. They didn't even have a music teacher. So I said, well, what do you have at home? And they said, we have junk. I said, okay, bring in your junk. We created them out of recycled materials. They're free.
Yeah.
And what's wonderful is when you have a kid, when you allow a child to make an instrument. I had no instructions. I just would pile the cans and the bottles and the shoe boxes. I said, so what do you think? How would you make an instrument out of these? once they created their own instruments, of course it was bedlam, but I kind of like bedlam. Then they had to write music. The next step is, of course you have to write music. Well, they don't know anything about music. I said, okay, let's take big paper, let's draw it. Work with 2 or 3 other kids, create a title, draw me the story with your instruments. And so they would create this big graphic notation piece. And then I said, okay, let's make the paper smaller for the next classes. Now you're going to invent notation. And music is really simple. It's sound, it's absence of sound, and it's time, it's duration. How long the note, how long the piece, and it's organized, but it's pretty simple,
Yeah.
And I said, how are you going to write high and low or medium? How are you going to write length, like how long a sound, how repeated, and they would create their own language. And the rule was they had to be able to play it when I came back the next week because the notation made sense to them. It had to sort of sound the same, and then I would work with them and they would create like a 20, 30-minute performance and perform it for their school. Amazing. They perform, the audience claps. I mean, it's just like the perfect sort of response that supports children feeling good about themselves. And my idea was always give them permission to write music and see themselves as creative. And I think that's the part that we don't do well with. I want people to argue with me and say, oh, I could have written a better piece than you. Like how they do with art. They go, oh,
yes,
I could have done better than that. Well, that's ownership. And that's what I want to inspire is ownership. Because I think then the art form becomes much more attractive to people when they feel it's about them, or they can do it too, or they have a relationship with it. But if it's for geniuses, it's like people who are super rich and live in mansions, that has nothing to do with me.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, part of my sense of wanting to share. I love my field. It's done a lot of damage to its audiences, but that's my interest, is that I think what you said, like with the mushrooms and, there is something there. It's something innate for all of us.
Yes.
And it's something that we can tap into and create. We don't have to have other people always creating it for us. But if they do, then we can say, oh, yeah, I have a deeper understanding of that.
Mm-hmm. If the listener is not picking up on that last 5 to 10 minutes, I mean, that's right there. That is accessibility 101 and bringing people into a space where you don't have to know it all. In fact, I absolutely love the idea of making your own music notation that makes sense to you and is not the treble or bass clef scales and in a way that is repeatable for you and makes sense. It's like, for myself, I know growing up throughout all of school, music notation was always very difficult for me. It was, like if you want me to sight read a piece, I'd be like, go get yourself some sustenance and maybe a backpack because you're going to be here a while.
Right.
So, but you give something to me in auditory form and a little bit of time to really soak it in and then to your illustration of coming up with your own language, I've got my own notation form for that works for me. It's like, okay, well, this particular progression, this is going to be 4 measures, or this is 4.5 measures, or this is how many counts, and then you can work with it, and it's not, and then you have the space to allow yourself to flow within whatever you happen to be doing in this.
Well, it's sort of teaching without a rubric, which I always hate rubrics. It is like when I teach, really what I want to do is I want to share my excitement. So you get excited and you go off and you do whatever you need to do. That my deep love of my field is transmitted, is a part of that electricity. And you're like, I hadn't thought. It's sort of like what Merce Cunningham did for me. He just woke me up. I then had to go do the work.
Yes, right.
But the work, once you've got them hooked, the work is not hard. It may be because you have the ulterior motivation. You know what you want. So you have to practice scales. Bummer. But it's a means to an end. It's a means to something that is woken up in you. And so, I've forgotten who I was talking to, and they were saying, this piano teacher, he was so, into the technique. And I said, well, technique is important. You have to have it. You have to have that practice. But when you want it for yourself, it's a totally different thing.
Yeah. Yeah, you're not worried about perfection. You're worried more about the delicacy of listening to the moment and listening to your heart and listening to how this makes you feel. And I'm not sure about you, but I know when I write for myself or I'm improvising for myself, it's a lot more slow. It's a lot more spacious. It's listening to the relationships of the notes and let them linger as long as they need to linger, and enjoy the space between the notes is just as important as the notes themselves.
Yes, I totally agree. Yeah.
Gosh, I tell you, Tina, I've really enjoyed this conversation so much.
Thank you. I've loved it. It's something I just, it's like the love of your children. You kind of want other people to love your children too.
Yes, I know.
It's something that I've been really fortunate that I've had this lifelong relationship with music. And I think that as I continue to write about music, it is also finding words to talk about it so that people who know nothing about music can start to feel comfortable about it. It's so in my book, I never talk about chords or progressions, or I talk a lot about energy, but my sense of energy is like, if I'm running and I'm running and running and running and I'm moving and I'm moving and moving, but I run out of energy, what happens at that moment? For me, when I'm exhausted, I am released, and it kind of like my heart goes up to God. It has no place to go but up, because I'm no longer in that daily kind of grind of moving. But that's really different than talking about, I could talk about how I love to switch meters. I love the 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, because it kind of lifts, but that's not as interesting, I think.
Yeah, I think the changing up the meter, that's good for like dislodging people from their comfort zone and getting them into, keeping them on their toes so that they don't get complacent and too comfortable. Yeah. I love it. Well, let's see. So I'm assuming that people can go find more about you out at your website at tinadavidson.com. So do you have anything that you're working on in the future for any new collaborations or projects that are coming up in the wind?
I do have another recording coming out in the spring. It's for piano and multiple strings, and it's actually going to be named Barefoot. We've done the recording, and we're finishing up the editing now. That's exciting, and I'm writing a piano piece, but I'm also really fairly committed to do some more deep writing about music. I'm really interested in composing or composing in the aging process. What happens for me as what happens to my creativity? Because for so long, my creativity was like so narrow and so driven, just about music. And now I'm feeling much more relaxed, like I can write, I can, that there are many more avenues for my creativity, and I'm really interested in that. So.
It is amazing when you start to reach that point where you're less concerned about, ego and upholding an image, and you find that free space to just be yourself and express yourself without any trappings.
Right.
And
it is very nice. Yeah.
It is a wonderful spot. Well, Tina, my friend, thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been delightful.
This was an absolute treat, and there's so much wisdom in there that I really hope that the listener even captures just a little bit of, just even a smidgen of what I've been able to walk away with. So
thank you.
To that, thank you so much. I hope to have this conversation again soon, and I look forward to hearing Barefoot. That's going to be amazing thing. And of course, you've got the memoir, which if you can, let's see if I can pull this up.
It's Let Your Heart Be Broken.
Let Your Heart Be
Life
Broken.
and Music of a Classical Composer, and you can get that on Amazon. And the new release is Hymn of the Universe, and it is wherever you stream your music.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Oh, Tina, my friend, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And may the universe continue to bless you with just wonderful music and a great spacious relationship with it as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you again.
Well, that was a top 10 moment for me. I just really enjoyed that conversation with Tina. You can find more of her music and more about her out at her website, tinadavidson.com. You can also find a large breadth of her works out, of course, on the streaming platforms, Spotify, Apple, and all of that. My thanks also goes to the folks over at Jensen Artists who have helped arrange for this conversation, plus sending her music my way. I appreciate you guys very much. Thank you so much for your time. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning into Ambient Discourses, conversations with musicians and composers who create musical experiences and sonic landscapes. Until next time, keep creating.